About 15 years ago, I did this parish mission in Florida, Port St. Lucie, and it was great. At least from my perspective, it was a great experience. I kind of like a typical parish mission. I went down. I spoke at all the masses one weekend, and then I guess it was like Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of that week. I celebrated mass, and there'd be like a talk, and it was. Anyway, I loved it. It was during Lent. I think it was late February. This mission was in Florida, so I was on a very practical level. I was getting out of New York in February to be in Florida, so I was kind of psyched about that. It was Port St. Lucie, where the Mets they got spring training. So I went to a couple of games while I was there, and it was just a great parish. It was just the whole experience was really awesome. Anyway, one day. A parishioner, a guy who had come to the mission, had caught me after Mass, and he said, "You want to grab lunch?" And I did, and really nice guy. I'm thinking he was about 60, maybe. And you ever meet somebody for the first time, and you feel like it's sort of crazy how much you have in common with them? You know, it's almost like you feel like you do know them, and you never have. Just sort of aspects of their life are very similar to yours. So that was the case here. He was from New York, grew up in Bayside in Queens, where I went to high school. I went to Holy Cross, and so he didn't go to Holy Cross, but he lived right near there. So we were kind of talking about the neighborhood. He came from this big Irish Catholic family. His father was a city fireman, so was mine. His grandparents were from Ireland, so were mine. His parents were from Brooklyn, so were mine. So it was just sort of like, what do we not have in common? So it was a lot of fun. It was just a very kind of enjoyable conversation. And then things kind of got a little serious. Maybe the second half of this meal. He told me that his father had died, I'm thinking it was about a year before, in New York. And he just described this legend, his dad. He just sounded like this larger than life, just this beloved figure in this family. Everything was about family and faith. Family, was really all that he cared about was his family and God. Anyway, I guess the moral of that little piece isn't even my point, but it's like I think like, you know, when we love God and when we love our families, loving God plus loving families equals awesome life. Like, I just think I find that so often. But that's not even my point. He started to talk. He talked about his dad, and then he talked about the experience of just being back at home in New York. I think he had 5 or 6 siblings himself, all married, all had kids. He's in Florida, and one of his sisters lived in Florida as well. Everybody else was in New York. So he talked about, you know, I guess the days during the wake, like in between the afternoon and the evening wake, you know, they all went out to eat and whatever. They were at each other's homes. And he said they just traded grandpa stories, the grandkids. He said it was amazing to watch. They all like took turns just telling these great stories about this beloved person in their lives. And he said he was looking at his kids, who were really kind of adults at this point, and he was watching them. They were all there, and they were loving it. But he said they were like a little out of the loop. And he used that expression a couple of times. They seemed out of the loop. And he explained that a little bit. He just said they were more quiet than the rest of their cousins, the rest of the grandkids. And they just had a little less to say. And he was able to notice it. Part of it, I think, was understandable. I mean, they grew up in Florida. You know, most of the rest of these kids grew up near Grandpa, so they just objectively had more experience of him over the course of their lives. But he said there was more to it than that. And this is really what he wanted to, I think, say to me. He said, because he was looking at his sister's kids as well, his nephews and nieces from Florida. And he said they weren't out of the loop. they were trading as many grandpa stories as the New York kids were. And he knew that. He could see it. He was kind of comparing his kids, Florida, to these cousins, Florida. And he knew why. And this was his point. And it was really kind of his regret. But it's my point, I think, to all of you this morning. The reason why his nephews and nieces from Florida seemed to know more about Grandpa than his own kids, he said, was because his sister talked to her kids more about Grandpa than he did his. And he kind of kept qualifying. He said he had a great relationship with him. His kids loved their grandfather. It wasn't like there was any, tension or, bad history. He just said, I think she just talked to them way more than he did. She told more stories. She communicated more values. She described, I think, in more detail, like where they came from and the things that sort of formed their lives, namely faith stuff and family stuff. He said that her kids were saying things that they only could have said it had they been told it. So here's the point. It's really important to talk about what's really important. Like, there are certain things in life that just really matter and that need to be known. We only know something if you hear it. Well, maybe you can read about it. But there are some things we know even before we learn to read because we hear it. We hear it from those people that matter most to us. And when we don't hear certain things, then we're a little out of the loop. We're a little bit more distant. We're a little bit more, disconnected. That was this guy's experience. And he kind of owned it. He wasn't blaming, he was kind of blaming himself. He said, I should have talked more to my kids over the years about some of these things. Look at this gospel. Actually, let's go back to last week's gospel for a minute. Jesus says to Peter, or he says to the apostles, so who are people saying I am? And they kind of give these answers, none of which are correct. And then Peter answers, he crushes it. He says, well, you're God, you're the Messiah, you're the one that all the other prophets were talking about, you're the one they were talking about. And Jesus is like, yes, you are right. That is who I am. And because you got it, you're the rock. And this church, this community, Peter, will be built on you. And now you get today's gospel. This is like the sequel. And so you go from this great moment where he's like, Peter has just been like elevated and affirmed. And then Jesus says, now I need to tell you guys what this church is going to look like and how it's going to affect your lives. And he says very simply, he says people are going to they're going to flat out oppose you. They're going to oppose me, and then once they're done with me, they're going after you. Because you all are going to say things that they're not going to want to hear. And he starts talking about crosses. He says, you guys follow me, expect crosses. Don't run from them, don't dodge them, don't deny them. Crosses are part of the deal if you're going to live truth and you're going to speak it. Think about what we do with crosses in a sense, or a crucifix. Like, we take this thing that's kind of objectively horrifying, and we kind of almost make it, a couple of months ago we put a new crucifix in the sanctuary in the church. It's beautiful. People are saying, like, oh, it's so beautiful. Think about it. Think about what we're saying. There's a dead guy nailed on a cross, and we're saying, oh, that's beautiful. We walk around with jewelry communicating the same thing. People get tattoos of a guy on a cross. Like, we take this thing that's kind of objectively awful, and in some respects, we kind of soften it because we don't want to hear the truth of it and the cost of it and the price and the pain of it. And neither did Peter. Peter, when Jesus says, hey, crosses are coming, get ready, Peter's like, no way. And then Jesus lets him have it. He's like, you need to hear this. You need to know this. This is absolutely true. You need Peter to hear this. It's kind of what this guy was lamenting in Florida. There were things that his kid should have known and should have heard, and for whatever the reason, he just didn't communicate it. He talked about, this is the Florida guy, being back at I guess it was after the funeral, and they went to a restaurant, and they're hanging out in this back room in this restaurant, and they started singing Irish songs. And he said, he's kind of watching, and he's looking at all his nephews and nieces. And he said, like, most of these grandkids knew most of these Irish songs, and his kids knew none. Now, what am I saying? That it's a sin if your kids don't know Irish songs? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. It is. No, it's not. It's not. But this guy was like, why did my kids not know those songs? Because I didn't teach them. Is that the end of the world? No. Is that the biggest of deals? No. But then he started to talk about, I guess, more serious stuff. That is a bigger deal. He talked about his oldest son, who was married and had a little boy who's a year old. And there was like no talk of a christening. There was no like, when are we getting the baby baptized? And he brought it up once, and the hand went up, like, Dad, I don't want to hear it. They shut down all conversation. And this guy is saying to me, like, you're going to bring a kid into the world, and you're not going to point them to God? Like, the foundation that is faith, like, that's not going to be a part of your kid's life? And he's saying this to me, and I said to him, well, did you tell him that? And he kind of got flustered, like, well, no, not really. He didn't want to hear it. Well, why are you telling me? I don't have the kid. I'm not your son. And then he told me about his daughter, who had just, again, recently moved in with her boyfriend. And he was just sort of disappointed in her with that and about that. And he said that they didn't even like this guy. They didn't think this guy was a particularly good person. And now they're going to sort of act like they're married when they're not. Unspoken levels of promise and commitment. How committed are we to each other? Like, that's never really clear, is it? Until you make it clear, until you make promises to each other. So he just seemed kind of disillusioned and discouraged, disappointed. And I said to him too, I said, did you ever tell your kids about, like, clear, like, what's okay and what's not? Did you communicate to your daughter, like, way before, like, when she was a kid? How, like, man, we'd never be okay with that. And kind of in an appropriate way explain why? Like, you're articulating it really well to me, the priest. But it sounds like you didn't so much to your kid or your kids. And now that they're adults, they're a little out of the loop. And a loop that's way bigger than not knowing Irish songs. Like, if they don't hear it, how will they know it? You know what they'll know? They'll know what the world says. They'll know what the world is communicating. Great line from St. Paul here this morning. It says, do not conform yourselves to this age. Man, how true. Don't conform yourself to this age. Because this age pretty much doesn't support our beliefs, our values. Not totally doesn't, but significantly doesn't. So this age will teach your kids another way. Unless you got them living in some cave somewhere, and then you can have other problems if you do that. Like if they're in the world, they got to be in the world, they're going to hear from the world. And much of the world isn't so good. So are they hearing enough from us, from you? So I remember watching, not too long ago, I was watching an episode of Friends. Why? I don't know why I was watching it, but I was watching it. It was on, and Monica and Chandler decide to move in together. And that was like, I guess it was this back and forth, are they gonna, are they not? They do, they announce it, and the studio audience went crazy. Like everybody celebrated it. And I was thinking, wow, like, look how times have changed. Remember Lucy? Remember when Ricky and Lucy slept in separate beds? Married Ricky and Lucy slept in separate beds? I mean, okay, one extreme, another extreme. How about somewhere in between Ricky and Lucy and the idiots on Friends? Maybe that's sort of where, like, we ought to be. But this age isn't there. It's not in the middle. And it's certainly not Ricky and Lucy. What's our response to this age? And hey, listen. Easy for me to say, right? I don't have any kids. I can do all this tough talk, and I don't have one kid to have to say anything. I know that. But that doesn't mean I'm wrong. It doesn't mean what I'm saying is untrue. It just means it's tough. Sort of, I guess, the way it was when Jesus said to the apostles today, this whole cross thing, it's not going to be pretty. How tough that must have been to say and to hear. But he did. Hey, listen, it's difficult. It's not easy. And we don't like difficult. We don't do difficult well. I was reading this at a red light, maybe 2 months ago in the middle of COVID, and there was a bumper sticker. And it was, I'd heard about this quote before, and then I saw it on this car. And it was basically a response to people complaining about the restrictions and the difficulty, how like our lives have been, sort of upended. And it said, your grandparents were asked to fight a war, and we're being asked to sit on a couch. Get over yourselves. Think about it carefully and act accordingly. Well, there's something to be said for that, like the difficult things that we just need to do, that we dodge. And I'm asking you all this morning to think about maybe some of the difficult things I need to say. Man, for God's sake, I got to say it out of love. I'm not saying get preachy and judgmental and go all sermon-like. I'm not saying that at all. This is tough. These are tough days. And we have been influenced by a very compromised culture. Man, but for God's sake, let's acknowledge that and ask ourselves, how can we respond to that? Let me ask you this right now, and then I'll sit down. Think of the people, the ones that you love the most in your lives. I don't know, can you think of something maybe that they need to hear? Because we're living in an age that, man, we don't want to conform to. And if they don't hear from you, they might conform to this age. Just something that you know is true. Tell them because you love them. Keep them in the loop.